Hey everybody, um, welcome to the latest workshop for Western Michigan. I'm going to get started here in a little bit, so just feel free to hang out. I'm just going to be warming up for a little bit, so feel free to just hang out. If anybody's watching currently, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and we should get started right at 7:30. I am currently just warming up. I feel like a spaceship is a good way to do that. I've been modeling in CAD all day, so it's nice to just get away for a little bit and just do something a little more loose and artistic. For whatever reason, spaceships are always really hard for me to do. I think it's because they can look like anything. It's like there's really only one kind of like actual spaceship. It's like the space shuttle, and that's the only thing that really exists. So anything beyond that is like purely hypothetical, and stuff like that, when it can look like anything, can be a little daunting to like come up with something that you feel like, oh yeah, it's totally like a thing. Like, I mean, because it doesn't exist, anything could be realistic, to a certain degree. So it's just like tougher for some reason. Hey Jeff, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. Anything new in the last week? Okay, we got a few more minutes. I might keep working on this. So yeah, anyway, Jeff, I hope everything's going well with you. It's kind of a weird time out there. Yeah, same. And I feel lucky to be doing so. How are things down Kalamazoo? Grand Rapids has been pretty quiet, luckily. We haven't really had any issues like getting groceries or anything like that. We've got family members out in San Francisco. They're having a tougher time getting access to everything. I think it's just like an issue of density, and also the number of cases. But I'm just curious how things are going for you there. In my opinion, most spaceships should be red. I think technically they all end up being gray because of, I would assume because of radiation in space. I know that Tesla car that went up looks a lot different now than when Elon threw it up there initially. And I'm pretty sure that's because of the radiation peeling the paint off. But then again, if there's a spaceship, it's in the future, and it could be like some amazing new technology that we just don't even know about yet. So I'm going to stick with red. And then, okay, we've got 2 more minutes. We'll see how far I can get with this silly thing before then. I've been planning to buy a new video game called Homeworld, and they have a lot of really cool, very brightly colored spaceships, so it kind of makes me feel like that's where this vibe is coming from. Yeah, same. I'm actually going to do a curbside pickup from a grocery store too. I think it was like a lot of initial, just everybody thinking that all the grocery stores would shut down, but I think when people realize that they still will have access to most of that stuff because it's essential, I agree. I feel like it has died down quite a bit, and I'm pretty thankful for that. Oh yeah, how's your class going that you're teaching? I don't know why that slipped my mind for some reason. Obviously, you are also still teaching. Okay, I'm almost done with this guy, and then I will get into the workshop proper for the people who showed up. And we are going to be doing the studies today, which everybody has done in one form or another, and I am just going to be sharing kind of my slight twists. It's not anything like groundbreaking, but I've had good experience with doing it this way. There we go. There's a little spaceship. That's something. Yeah, I got takeout from a local brewery here too, Brewery of Avant, and they had like a little outdoor area where you could like order online using a QR code at their front door, and then they just pop your order out right there, and have it waiting for you in like minutes. It was really nice. Okay, I'm gonna start sketching on this. Um, yeah, it's tough. I mean, luckily, I mean, I don't know how you run your class, but I would imagine that having a 3D program that you're teaching lends itself more easily to doing something online as opposed to, I don't know, a sculpture course. Maybe that's overly simplifying it, but hopefully it makes your life a little easier. Okay, there's my spaceship for now. Um, yeah, whoever else is on the stream, feel free to introduce yourself, ask questions as we go along here. If you're new to the stream, I'm just going to be giving a really simple demo over the next 2 hours over how I do studies of new materials. And this is something I kind of just came upon as as I tried to understand what the artists that I look up to, how they got to where they're at. And the person I'm thinking about, his name is Kim Jung-ji, and I've brought him up several times during the workshop on site and here on the stream, because he is just he's amazing. He's this Korean artist that seems like he can draw anything from any position. And because of that, I just have always like been really interested in his like technique for that very reason. It's just like it seems like a supernatural ability to draw any object from any point of view, and I've just tried to like figure out how he does it to better build up my own skill set. And so a little test I've given myself is I've started to do studies of objects, whether it's something sitting in front of me or if it's something that is on the screen on my computer. Then I try to understand like how it's built, rather than just sitting here and drawing this chair, which is going to be my first subject. So if I was to do just a traditional study, and I'm going to try to do this without any, or not very much undoing or erasing, because I want to try to share how I do this with my my traditional mediums, if I'm just sketching with a pen and paper, because studying should be, I think, separate from whatever the tools you're using. It doesn't really matter what you use. I mean, you can use crayons for all I care, because what you're trying to do is understand the structure of an object. And I'm just going to draw the side of this thing right here. So if I was studying this chair, I'm noticing like the way each of these arms and legs are built. The arms are obviously upholstered. These legs, some of them are spun on a lathe. Others are tapered and have some asymmetrical parts to them. And then there's also an overall design language that I'm noticing. It's this kind of contrast between these really linear planar shapes. And I'm going to draw on top of this a little bit here. Some of these are these really linear planar shapes, like on the bottom. And those are contrasted with really elegant arcs up and down. And then on top of that, there's some kind of like mid-ground. So this part in the front has got this little shape that pops up in the front. For anyone who needs to know, this is a Finn Juhl chair. He is I believe, Danish furniture designer, and it's really, really impressive stuff. Like, I generally trend towards a lot more minimalist pieces, but I've been gaining more of an appreciation for this in the last few years. So I'm understanding what all of these different objects bring to the design, and it's like this really elegant sense of balance. Like, some of these things are like almost Art Deco-y, like this weird form here. The fact that there's like this little ball on the end, like, that seems like such a weird addition to make, but I'm kind of reverse engineering all these pieces to understand like what the overall design intent is. It's simplicity. I'd say there's an organic versus, let's say, angular language. So what I mean by that is there's a lot of things that are offset against one another. Like, those linear forms that I was pointing out before, here and here, are offset by all the roundness that's happening in the seat. And so I think what I want to do next is get back to my original sketch. So if I was to finish this, this view, which I guess I can do just really quickly, if I get quiet a little bit, feel free to ask questions. It's a little tough for me sometimes to draw something that's visually appealing and talk at the same time, because I've talked about this before. My attention just gets pulled in a few different directions at once. And what I would suggest is that this is, what I'm showing right now is how most people do studies. You look at an object in its position. So if I was sitting next to this chair, I have a point of view or perspective that I'd be looking at it from, and that would kind of define what my sketch looks like. And that's kind of the generally accepted way that most people do studies. You can see I'm just blocking in these parts here. I'm not getting too worried about perspective issues or proportion issues, which I can already see I have a few of, I'm really drawing to understand what the designer's intent was. And that's kind of the difference with these studies versus just studying an object for the sake of drawing it. You know, I think a lot of people don't study deliberately, and that's kind of the whole point of what I'm trying to share with you here. Like, see, there's a big issue with my perspective here, so I'm going to go ahead and just fix this leg so it doesn't look completely broken. So I think this is how most people study, and I think a lot of people get frustrated and they don't understand why they're not improving quicker. And a lot of the teachers that I've looked up to and have learned a lot from, one of the things that they continuously like kind of drill into me is that you need to be deliberate about what you're studying. You can't just draw this chair over and over. Like if I started drawing this again, I might come up with better lines, but I don't know if I would really understand what the designer's intent was. And so this, I guess it's kind of a game that I started doing with these studies, is I start trying to draw the object from completely different perspectives, which means that I'm going to have to fill in some of the information here that you can't see. So I am not aware of what's happening in the back here. I can see that there's a piece coming around. And so what's fun about doing studies like this is that you kind of have to become a little bit of a detective. So I think that there's got to be some connection between the back of the chair and this piece. You can also see, hey Isaac, long time no see. How are you doing? How's your classwork coming? If you have any questions about what we're doing, feel free to ask. I'm just going to keep moving forward in the meantime. Okay, so what I'm drawing right here is what I think the cutaway view, the section view of this chair back is. So there's definitely there's an arc in the back, which is this, and I can see that there's a bar there, and I think there's probably just something that connects the back here. And then I'm going to say it's something similar on the bottom. I think there's probably a bar that goes to the center. So just looking at this chair and understanding that somebody's going to sit on it and apply weight, I know that there has to be some connection there in the middle. So making those observations is going to allow me to try to draw this chair from a different angle. So I think for this next one, I'm going to give myself a through line to start, because I would occasionally do this for a real drawing. So all this line is doing is setting up my perspective. So when I just do a single line like that, just so you know, what I'm actually seeing in my head is the full kind of perspective window that that line represents. So it might seem a little weird to think that that line can represent this entire perspective, but if you think about creating a grid and that grid being perpendicular to this line here, you can imagine that line being right in the middle of this cube, and then the perpendicular lines go in the other direction, and then you've got verticals, and so this whole grid exists all based on that single point-to-point line, which is what I've done here. So I'm just going to cut this off and move it real quick. Okay, so what that allows me to do is it starts to put the chair together in my head. So I'm looking at that seat. I think that's where I'm going to start, because we're looking down on this chair right now. So it's got a smaller arc in the back than in the front. In the front, it arcs, but it arcs vertically. It doesn't arc front to back. So this one is going to be pretty subtle. And so hopefully you can see how the perspective is starting to come together. I'm going to be spinning my canvas a little bit, so let me know if that gets disconcerting or confusing. But I am drawing on a Cintiq, which is a screen interface device. So I'm drawing directly on top of the screen, so I have to shift it around just like I would if I was drawing on a piece of paper. I'm also going to give myself that was an accident, a center line. And I can see that this seat is dipping down in the center slightly. So a lot of these construction lines can happen just by giving yourself a simple little center line like that. And you can start to see where curves happen, edges start to meet one another, and there's not a lot of line work to be done on the seat just because it's such a soft thing. And what I've chosen to use for my brush is a really thick brush that doesn't have a lot of transfer. And so what that means is there's not a lot of chances for me to do like subtle changes in direction. So you can see I'm just going in and kind of drawing a little bit of thickness for the seat. That's good to hear, Isaac. I'm glad you're doing okay. And I'm glad you made it to the workshop. So feel free to sketch along with what I'm doing if you're bored. Okay, so I've drawn the seat here because there's nothing, from my point of view, looking down in this direction, there's nothing in the way that would cover up what I'm trying to draw. So that's another thing that you have to be kind of aware of, the fact that you have to draw everything kind of from front to back, because anything behind this, if I had drawn that first, you'd be able to see that. Like if I tried to draw what's underneath the seat, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So you also have to make kind of a bit of a tough decision about where your perspective is going to cut off parts of what you're looking at. And so I'm also noticing now that I start to sketch out these sections on the arm that I've done that right there. So if I was doing this on a piece of paper, this overlap would have to stay there, but because I am drawing digitally, I have the luxury of an undo key, so I will probably use that in a second, but I want you to see like where my mistake is, so you can understand that even when I have done this before and am pretty comfortable drawing like this, I still can get it wrong. So this line is quite a bit tougher. So looking at this cube here, you can see that like the perspective is going to vanish as you go down. And so the legs of this chair are also going to get closer together as you go down. And so I'm also like seeing like in my head a line that goes across there, but I'm just kind of eyeballing where that actually is to end that line. And I've got my connector that brings the two legs together. And then I'm going to do something similar here for where the arms fall. So I'm seeing that I did something wrong on this left arm. Like it looks like kind of a jelly bean shape, but they droop pretty significantly in the middle. So if I was going to do a section, which is what I probably should have done with the first one, it'd be more like this. And the edges, because they're such an organic form, I'm actually a little bit unsure of what they would look like. So this is one of those cases that looking at those arms, I now have to make my best guess about what this section looks like. I'm going to erase this away just so for clarity this makes a little bit more sense. There's the second arm. Okay, and you can see this side piece. I'm actually going to erase a little bit of the way of the front because the perspective that I've chosen, that actually connects on the inside here, so you wouldn't see it from where I had drawn it. So that was another issue that I can correct now because I'm doing this digitally. Okay, so this side piece starts about halfway up on the front, so again, it's just like I'm building this thing like a skeleton, and so I can, just by looking at this, I put two little circles for the section there, and I know I can start just a little bit above that and come back in perspective and be reasonably assured that I will be in the ballpark of where this piece would end up if I had the actual perspective to reference. But again, I kind of have to like put this stuff together based on the perspective that I created and make this chair fit within that reality. So again, just coming straight back in my perspective, it's kind of the bottom of the back leg of the chair, and it's tapered, so it's skinnier at the bottom. We're going to come up, and now I kind of have to start to consider like what the proportions are. So coming back here, we can see that the proportions are about, I'd say like roughly, it's close to 1/3 and 2/3. just, to eyeball it. And then front to back, it's maybe 2/3 this way. So I think this section and this section are almost identical, and there's a little bit more in the vertical side, obviously. But that's kind of in my head what I'm aiming for in terms of their proportion. And if I really wanted to understand this chair, I could even go as far as like starting to play with the proportions, but that's kind of beyond the scope of the kind of study that I'm doing here. What I'm really trying to do, what I'm really trying to do is create a internal library of forms that I will be able to call on later, if I was ever designing a chair or just kind of got stuck on something I was working on. Because I think the bigger your internal library is for, like design vocabulary, the better designer / artist you are. Because I really think that there's just something about actually sketching an object out from different perspectives that literally creates new connections within your brain, because you're forced to basically connect dots that are not spelled out for you. Like, you have to make connections. So right here, speaking of connections, I'm noticing there's a connection from this upper point to where it meets the seat, and that has got to be where this secondary support is. And I'm just going to draw kind of see-through lines. That's right there, and so the other side is going to sneak in similarly. And I'm doing my best to be accurate about this and to get it in a single line, because I want to show that, like, what I'm really aiming for right now is not a great drawing. What I'm aiming for is understanding this chair. And I think what I might end up doing at the end of this is try to draw it from memory and see how close I can get after I've done some of these. So does everything I've explained so far make sense? Like, does my reasoning for why I draw like this make sense? I'm also going to finish up this far leg now. This is also just a really enjoyable way to draw, at least for me, because sometimes it can be a little daunting if you just sit down and you're like, I want to get some drawing done tonight. I feel like I'm in the mood to draw, but I don't really know what I should be drawing. This is a really great way to halfway create something new and halfway study an object, because like the subject matter is already kind of defined for you, but you get to create something kind of fresh and different by actually designing it from a different point of view. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say designing it, but illustrating it from a different point of view. So, I think that's pretty close. I don't think anybody would be confused about what chair this is supposed to be. And so I think now I've got a pretty decent understanding of it, and I think that my drawings will continue to get better from this point out. Okay, so we got that one. Let's see if I can do one more from, again, like the nice thing about doing these studies is that you can kind of challenge yourself to draw some like pretty ridiculous forms. And maybe ridiculous forms is not the right way to look at it, but perspectives, I think, is more like what I was thinking about. So that was that box that I created this in. So right now I'm considering what the next view should be to really illustrate this chair, and I think it's pretty clear that I need to understand for myself like what the back of it's going to look like. So I just need to come up with like an interesting perspective. So in this case, I am going to just sketch out like some perspective boxes so I can understand like what would be maybe something fun to play with. Like if I tried to do like a fisheye lens, where the perspective is really forced and aggressive, could be kind of interesting. A fisheye lens is just something that looks really, really distorted. The tough thing about doing it is that there are no straight lines. This is technically, I think, how our eyeballs work. The way that our eyes bring in visual information, I'm pretty sure, has a lot to do with the shape of them, which is a sphere. And so if I was to try to draw a chair in a fisheye view, it would be something like that, which is like a cube that essentially had air blown into it, which I think could be kind of fun to try to do. So yeah, I think I'll give that a shot. Just gonna move these guys over here, give myself some clean canvas to draw on. I'm also going to limit the amount that I look at this chair. I think that's another thing that you should do, whether you're studying something by looking at it, or if you are studying something in the way I'm doing it now. Because I think if you force yourself to fill in even more gaps in your understanding of an object, I don't know, there's just something really tough but really rewarding about it, because I don't know, it's like a question of realigning what your visual reality inside your brain is. It's just it's a way of looking at the world in a way that you control, and I think it's tough for a lot of people because you don't really realize how little control you have in your day-to-day visualization of things. Like, you're never forced to take something in front of you and see it in a different light. So in this case, I have given myself a box to work in, but I'm going to try to limit the amount of drawing through that I do. This one will be a little bit loose initially, but hopefully the end drawing works out, because I can be a little loose initially to get everything more accurate, and then I can start to fix some of those lines later on. Hey Genevieve, welcome to the stream. There's no real reason to want a perspective over another. I mean, you could do one-point perspective all day. It's more about being able to do different perspectives, and fisheye is probably the most difficult, because you're making things line up and look real and believable, but no, it's really difficult to draw like this, at least initially. This is another thing that I picked up. That's actually a little too low. This is another thing that I picked up from Kim Jung-ji. He can draw really complicated things, like a motorcycle, in a fisheye perspective, because again, he just understands these objects so well that he can take straight lines and redraw them in such a way that you perceive them to be straight, but when you actually really look at the thing that he's drawn, there's not a straight line to be seen, and that's kind of what I'm attempting to do. And so it's not a question of when you would want to do a three-point perspective. It's just a question of can you do it? And that's what these studies are all about, is challenging yourself for what you're capable of doing, because you might never actually use it in a professional setting, but I mean, I just feel like there's so many things in the world that are worth doing because they're difficult, and they can lead you down some other paths of realization that you wouldn't get to if you were just doing only the things that you knew you would end up using at some point. I just think the world is too complicated to only do what's expected. You'll get by fine, but I just think that you'll have a slightly less interesting life. So I am going back to this chair a little bit, because the back especially is something that I don't really know what it's going to look like. And so these lines should be straight, but you can see they're curved, and they're also getting slightly smaller as they get further away. And so we're working with my perspective grid that I have in my head, and we're also working with this fisheye angle. I am going to start erasing away a little bit of the mistakes that I find. And we can see that the chair is at a pretty steep, the back is, I'd say 15, 20 degrees. of an angle. I'm going to draw that in because this seat back is actually really complicated. So this line right across the top is straight across, and I can see that the back of the chair is significantly further back than the rest of this. So I was just about to start the back of the chair there, but in reality it's actually back here, and it dips down. I can show you why. So this arc is actually the correct arc, and that's because it goes down and then back. And so the back of the chair is actually down here, whereas I was going to draw it there, but I had to do a little bit of, I don't know, I guess geometry to really understand like what this form should be. So it looks like the bottom of the seat drops pretty low in the overall body of the chair, so I'm going to go from this point in that direction, and then I'm going to say that's my bottom. So I've got roughly my center here to the center there, and those lines are really hard to all line up, but hopefully you can see that I just took a few points that made sense to me from my initial grid, and I just keep stringing additional lines along. It's almost like making a spider web. It's like you created those first few lines, and then you allowed them to kind of lead you along. So I'm being a little bit more, I'm growing those little shapes, whatever that wood form is, just because I think it's interesting. And now I'm actually going to put the back of the chair support in. So I've seen some of his other designs, and he does like really simple connections, so I'm pretty sure it's just going to be something like that, that connects on the inside right there. So that's the support for the back. It's kind of tough to see if there would be any seams back there. You can see there's quilting in the front, those little points. I don't know if it's called quilting, but whatever it is when you shove that little circular thing into upholstery. If anybody knows what it's called, put it in the chat so I can get it out of my brain, because it's going to be stuck there until I look it up later. Tufting, that's what it is. I just remembered. So these are really hard to draw in this perspective, these arms, because they get narrower at the bottom and they also move forward, and they also have this weird S shape to them. Let's finish this front leg. So again, these arcs are really hard to draw initially. You know, I have a steadier hand than I did, you know, yesterday, I would say. I mean, all I mean by that is like you continue to improve your craft, and I've been trying to like get smooth arcs ever since I started drawing, so it's just something that might come a little easier to me when I do this stuff. So some of these like movements that I do and lines that I make, don't stress yourself out if you can't do them, because some of the simple stuff that I do is actually like pretty difficult, and I realize that. So please don't get too down on yourself if like I end up making a line that you're like, oh, that's surprising that he got that like to line up the first time. It's because I did it wrong 10,000 times. And that's the only reason I can do it right now. And I can't do it right all the time, I just do it right most of the time. And that can also change depending on how familiar I am with what I'm drawing, and also, you know, how warmed up I am, how recently I've drawn something else. There's just a lot of factors involved. So I've got this side piece here, which I think looks pretty decent in terms of its overall proportion. It's not dropping in the back as much as I would like. I'm noticing that it is higher in the front, but I think it should even drop more than that. But it's sufficient for now. The seat is also a real pain in the ass, because this is a really organic shape, and all I really know about it is it's narrower in the back than it is in the front, and I want it to match this seat. And I'm realizing it doesn't really matter, because all of that stuff in this area right here, I don't have to draw any more lines there, because it terminates in a place behind the backrest that the viewer will never see. So I kind of get a get out of jail free card there. But I am going to continue to try to show some of the form within the seat. And then I know that there's another piece that I said right there is probably in the back holding up the seat. So I'm going to draw one more where I think it belongs, which I think is here, which is actually going to be seen from the back. And I also know that because the side one is here, I can trace these lines across. I can start drawing the back side of this thing. There, so I think that's pretty much there. I don't think I'm missing anything. I don't think you'd see this back leg down here. I mean, no, you wouldn't. Based on the perspective, that back leg is right there, so you would not see that. But what I'm going to do now is just clean up this drawing just a little bit. In the same way I would if I was, working on this on a pencil and paper. So yeah, you can see that I've got a pretty decent drawing of the back view of that chair. I think there are some issues with it, like the back armrest could probably be a little bit higher. Oh, you know what else? I'm missing part of it there. So again, I can just like see the difference in the side and the back. There's a little bit of a height difference. That's all I got to do. And now the back arm is shown. So now all I'm doing is kind of changing the lighting of the lines. So I've gone over this in some of my other workshops. Just like giving some weight to your line work can go a long way to explaining a form, even if you're not using any shading. For instance, all the surfaces that are in front of something else have a thicker line, and then also all surfaces that are facing downward, like literally to the ground that the object is sitting on, should also be darker. And just doing that with your drawings, no matter what you're doing, like design, art, anything, a line drawing needs to have some consideration given to the line weight, because I think it just adds so much to the drawing. Plus, just from an illustrative point of view, I think it just looks nicer if you take the time to just go around, kind of clean up whatever you're working on. See here, this side arm, that's actually the top and it's thicker, but I did that because there's so much visual noise happening behind it. And the same here on that arm. So we can just erase away a little bit of this cube, so it's just a little bit less distracting. Yeah, so now I've got the chair from a completely different perspective. And I feel like doing that, I understand like what this chair looks like now. I feel comfortable that I could draw it from a side view. I feel comfortable that I could draw it from a top view. Like, I feel like I understand this now. I could even build you like a little model of it in CAD, and that's because I've forced myself to really come to an understanding of like what this object looks like. So now, just merge some layers. Okay, so now I could just, in a completely blank slate, I'm just going to draw this from memory now, a side view, just to see if I can get it reasonably close. Just for my own, curiosity. I just want to see if I can do this. So I think the back is perfectly vertical, just like the front. And I remember that proportion. I think this is like 2/3 to the seat and 1/3 to the bottom. And then I've got the arm, and it's got that little lift up because all of his parts in this chair had that. I know that the armrest was closer to the front than the back. I remember that. The seat had a little bit of a lift up, and so I think you'll see that there. I'm going to guess it's the same for the back of the seat, because why would he do something different? I think the seat might have come out over the front, maybe. I'm going to leave that and see if that's the right decision. I know the back had that weird little kick up, and I know that the side piece is an S shape, and it connects directly to this section on the bottom here. I'm just going to erase this away to clean it up a little bit, because this is like a perfect side view, no perspective at all. I know the back dropped down a little bit because that was something that I had a hard time with at first. And then it comes in like that. And I think the back, so you won't be able to see this piece, but it's right there. I think that connects right there. So I'm fairly certain if I went on the FinJoule website and I found the side view of this chair, it would look like this. And now I can draw it from every perspective because I took the time to understand it fully and understand my interpretation, because you can never really know what somebody else is thinking, but my interpretation of what the designer was thinking when they made it. And again, some of these proportion issues are a little wonky. This back leg is definitely wider than it should be, but essentially that's the chair that I've been drawing for the last, 40 minutes. So yeah, we're just going to keep doing this and understanding like what makes an object look the way it does. So yeah, first one was a chair, and a chair that I wish I owned, but probably won't for the foreseeable future because I think that's a $4,000 chair. Okay, before I move on to the next one, does anybody have any questions about anything I did there? There's a little bit of a delay, so I'm just going to move on, but please type it out in the chat if you have any thoughts. Okay, the next one is going to be a little bit of a different experience. So this one I just picked because I thought it looked cool. Also, my brother-in-law is in the Coast Guard in Kodiak, Alaska. And so, I don't know, when I think about like mechanical objects like helicopters, I think of like, what they look like, and the Coast Guard always has really cool paint schemes. So what I'm going to do with this object is identical to what I did with the chair. In this case, this is a more complicated object, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. I guess I'll do that in red again. Okay, so for this helicopter, there's a lot of stuff going on, and when you have a complicated object like this, it can be kind of daunting to understand where to start. And when I think about doing something like this, I try to break it down into its key forms. So I'm going to draw a side view of this first, just so I can like explain everything that I'm looking at. A side view makes sense for things that are symmetrical, especially vehicles. And so I'm looking at this thing, and the main body very clearly is the primary shape. So this is actually not that complicated in terms of a form. Very aerodynamic and pretty simple. I think I got the nose a little bit off. It looks like it's a 50-50 split, so I think I should actually have it be quite a bit bigger than what I drew initially. So that basic form here, it's got a section in the middle, which is that main body of the fuselage that's completely identical front to back. There's no tapering until you get to the cockpit up here, where the window is, and then when you go back to the tail. And the tail is also tapering vertically, but I can also see that it gets skinnier. So from a top view, we're looking at something like this. which is not a very complicated form. So that's the primary form, number one. Number two are all the secondary details. So for me, it's this top piece, which is where the engines and a lot of the mechanics are, and then the tail. So I'm looking at this, and it looks like it kicks up in kind of a weird way in the back. So again, what I did with the chair is like you got to be a little bit of a detective to understand these objects. And like because I'm looking at something that I found on the internet, you could conceivably like go and find other views to reference. But that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're doing here. And what we're doing here is like trying to fill in blanks that we are coming to our own conclusions about, as opposed to being given the answer. So there's a secondary form there, and then the tail, I'm looking at it, and it's just slightly above the height of the rest of the helicopter. So we're looking at something, it's got this kind of round shape in the front, which is interesting, and I never would have drawn on my own, but you know, that's what we're doing. We're building up a visual library right now. And it definitely gets wider at the bottom. What does it come to a point or something like that? It's a little harder to tell. But sorry, Photoshop is jumping on me. Based on the way this rear tail is oriented, I think that there's probably a pointy part that tail is sitting on top of, so I'm going to go ahead and guess that there is a point to that tail. So I think that's what the proportion is, and if the tail was not bent down, it could be like that. I guess that's actually a tertiary detail. So I say this and this are my number two. So those two shapes are the secondary part of what makes this object. I don't want to get too complicated to get to like, 5 levels of different sizes of parts to this, because we're not actually trying to build it. We're trying to understand it well enough to articulate it in different views. So the last thing I'm going to do is find the tertiary details. So for me, that's the engine on the side, which looks like kind of a mushed cylinder in the front, and then you can see that it rotates out where the exhaust is. So from the side view, you'd see an ellipse, and that's because this shape in top view is coming out. So it's like if you bent a pipe and then cut it, it'd be kind of like a shape like that, like a macaroni almost, which is a really kind of organic, strange shape. But if you look at helicopters, that's how a lot of them are actually formed. So I'd say the engine is a tertiary shape. The side door, which I can see by how it's slid back here, is about, I want to say it's like a perfect square when you take the two doors next to one another. And then right behind the door, we've got a rear wing, which is kind of a pill shape. There's also this weird pylon on the side. I don't know if that has fuel or if it has like some other purpose. Maybe it's actually, oh, you know what I think that is? It might be for landing on water, kind of like a pontoon boat would have. And we've got the tail and the rotor. So it looks like it's 4 on top, 4 in the back. And again, we don't have to like figure out how all this stuff works, but we at least have to understand like how the big parts come together. And I can also see by that tail that it's kind of kicked out at an angle. So if we're looking at it from the front view, I think it actually points out at a slight angle, like maybe, I don't know, like 5 degrees. And the shape of it is pretty interesting too. Just big square oars coming off. So this is a pretty complicated object. Helicopters are really hard to draw believably. So this is definitely one of those things that I think benefits from a little bit of understanding. So I think that's most of the tertiary details. I think I made the nose too long now that I'm looking at it. It's not that pointy. And we can even use this black line on the side to figure out like what the real balance is. So that's the paint job right there, part of the front. Yeah, that feels better to me. And there's also this window at their feet so they can see down in front of them. And obviously this kind of sensor pod up front. I'm noticing more details as I go along. Obviously, don't want to forget the wheel, which is attached They don't, airplanes have landing gear that go inside the body, but not all helicopters have that, and this one obviously doesn't. And I can't see a rear wheel back here. Yeah, you can see just a little bit of a hint of one right there that's hidden by the pylon, which is closer to the front than I would have expected. I don't know, for whatever reason, I feel like it should be back there by the tail, but I'm sure they have a reason not to have one. I'm also noticing the tail's got a kick up in the back, so I drew that wrong the first time. I'm looking at this angle right here. Okay, so that's kind of the overall proportions of the helicopter. Something else that we're going to have to keep in mind as we're drawing it is what the sections look like, and this gets a little bit more complicated, so I'm just going to draw right on top of this reference image so you can see the things that I'm considering, even though I might not be sharing it out loud. So the other thing that makes a believable helicopter really difficult is that these sections change over every foot of the helicopter. And it's because like these details are stacked on top of each other. So you've got these primary, secondary, and tertiary details that are all working together to create this object. And all throughout the body, they come together in these like intersections. So what I'm doing right now is just drawing through, like if I could see through what this helicopter looks like. And I know that there's an engine on the other side because this thing is symmetrical. And I can see that it dips down right there. And so it's got like this kind of three-layer thing happening at the top. And I think that probably tapers off to the back. I don't need to draw another one right there. But another thing I'm noticing is the tail is really skinny on the top and then fatter on the bottom. So this kind of has more of a, I don't know what you would call that. It's just like a stacked shape. It's got this little round part on the top and this larger part on the bottom. And it just gets smaller and smaller as it goes down, which is pretty easy to understand. And then you can see all these radiuses. Everything is like very soft in terms of how it's like starts and ends. Like this is like just kind of an airplane wing design, and that applies to anything that really flies in the air. Like even the rotors up here have this shape. It's this teardrop form that just allows things to move through the air more efficiently. And so just knowing that, like knowing what all these things have, like coming into it with that knowledge that I have is going to allow me to fill in some of these blanks here. Like you can see it here as well on the front. Like these aerodynamic shapes start to duplicate themselves from object to object if you start drawing other, flying objects. If you did studies of helicopters, cargo planes, passenger planes, fighter jets, you start to see like some things begin to become repetitive. And that's just because like when an object functions a certain way, a lot of those functions are dictated by the physics of that object's reality, in this case flying through the air. So this first study we're going to do from a different point of view, again, like what I had done with the chair, but this one's going to be a little bit simpler, so I can kind of like get my legs underneath me in terms of like what this object actually looks like. So do you have any questions about the helicopter stuff, like helicopters in general, or like what these parts are? Feel free to jump in if you do. Okay, so I'm going to challenge myself to try to draw it from a top-down view because I don't really understand what's going on at the top, but maybe as I draw it, I'll be able to fill in some of the blanks. And because this object is a little bit more complicated, I am going to give myself some perspective lines to work off of. Just your major axes, front to back, I'll call that Y, left to right is X, and up and down is Z. Anybody who's worked in CAD modeling software will understand that. It's just about how to speak about directions in a more articulate way than just like left or right. So this is my center line. So the first thing I want to do is draw the actual center of the entire object. So this is where drawing that side view is going to come in handy. So right off the bat, I'm just going to block in this very rectangular central piece, which I think is exactly the same thickness all the way through. kind of the side profile, wraps underneath. No, that thing hanging from the front, these are all sensor pods. So this is, you know, infrared sensors, maybe a light. These are all just different cameras and sensors that the pilots use to see around them. It's a good question, though. So that's the outside. This is the opposite side. Right now, I'm just trying to get the basic block out done. So right here is where the passenger compartment stops, and it starts to taper off. And I can see that the windshield is actually pretty straight across the front. I would think that there'd be more of an angle, but it's actually very straight. And so this is where we start to come down for the windshield. And I'm looking at these surfaces, and I'm just imagining what they would look like in an opposite perspective, knowing that the bottom of the nose is here. And when I get about halfway, which is right here, then I will come out to the front and round that corner. So this little X right there marks the front of the vehicle. So now I can also pull this line back, knowing that it has to meet up with the side at some point. So that comes up there. And I could draw through on the opposite side, but what I'm actually going to do is try to draw these forms as they fall off. And when I get lost, I just come back to my perspective for help. Because this line right here is, I'm unclear about how to connect it, but I feel it gets pretty tight right there, and I drew a very soft transition. I think that is pretty decent. So now I can take this line and connect it. I think I made the height a little too tall. Looking at this thing, I think it's actually a little bit wider, like a squished loaf of bread. And so I'm making a change to the proportions of the helicopter as I go, because I need to always be double checking everything that I'm drawing. So the bottom of the helicopter is not going to be down here anymore. It's actually going to be up there, which I do feel better about looking at these proportions now. So I'm just going to draw a simple line to the back, even though we aren't going to be able to see it. It's just for my own peace of mind. And now you can see that at the end of the passenger compartment, we've got this long arc that goes down to the tail. And I drew kind of an arc there, but in this photo, it looks like it's a straight line. So I'm going to try to be as accurate as possible. So if it's a straight line in the photo, I'm going to do a straight line in my study. And on the side, I'm guessing it will be somewhat similar. You know, it doesn't get concave or anything, it just continues to go back in space. And now we're just going to be drawing that very weird shaped rear tail. And again, so this is the top of the helicopter, if I took it back to perspective. And so I want the tail to be just above, so it looks like I'm pretty close to what I wanted, where I wanted it to be. It needs to get wider at the bottom, and I'm also going to give a little through line because I know that the rear tail propeller, or rotor, whatever it's called, is going to be on an angle like that. And I'm just going to draw on some simple ellipses to remind myself that's an angle I'm here thinking about it. So I'm also thinking about the fact that this tail has got thickness, so I can draw on some cut lines to show that it gets thicker and rounder as it gets closer to the front. I know it kicks up. And then I've got my x-axis that goes left to right. So I'm just going to try to get as close to that as I can. And we can put our tail in. I'm kind of eyeballing the width. Maybe I shouldn't do that. It's a little bit longer than what I had drawn. That's okay. We are just kind of learning about the shapes of this thing right now. We don't need to be exact. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that primary form for the overall helicopter. So now I can start dropping in the secondary details, which I did start to do in the tail because I got a little sidetracked. But okay, so now the engines fit right about that midpoint. So let's say right here is the first one. Just doing that soft ellipse shape. I know that it comes out to make the exhaust, which actually gets kind of pointed on the end. So you can see I'm being pretty loose with my lines because, again, like, I'm not trying to do an amazing drawing at the moment. I'm trying to understand the shapes of this object. So looking at this piece in the center, I think it's skinny in the front, widest in the middle, where this giant rotor is, and then I think it gets skinny in the back again. So that's going to be my kind of hypothesis. So if that's my center line right there, that's going to define how I start this piece. And you can see that the rotor is also right dead center. So I think that I will put the rotor right there in that vertical line. So anybody who's done any like 3D modeling or just drawing through, and we've talked about that in a handful of our other workshops, is the fact that, like, I'm really just connecting skins of these parts. So all of these lines, you could imagine them just being like sheets of, you know, plastic or metal that I'm just kind of laying down, and that's what all of these like center lines and side lines represent. And it allows me to build this stuff without knowing how it looks immediately. It kind of can feel a little bit like magic, but honestly, it's just the easiest way. So that kicks out. That kicks out. It's the easiest way to draw something symmetrical and complicated. Because if you can figure out what all these surfaces are doing by drawing their section, it can help you solve a lot of your issues. On this side, I don't think, and this is just like based on my understanding of based on my understanding of helicopters, there's going to be a pass through. So if there's a window and a door on the opposite side, I think it's a fairly safe guess that there's going to be one here too. And again, because this door is cut into this side, all of these lines have already been defined by these sections that I drew earlier. And that applies to anything that goes up and down, left to right. It has to be believably on the surface. And so all these lines need to follow everything else that I've kind of laid out as my starting point. I can see there's a little pill-shaped wing over here. Underneath it, I'm going to guess that there's another one of these pylons over there on that side too. So yeah, it's just a lot of drawing through, just connecting the dots. And now, once I have most of my reference points into the drawing, it starts to come together pretty quickly. I can start putting in details like the front window, smaller details that I'm noticing, like it actually has like rear view mirrors, which makes sense because the pilot probably needs to see like what the people on the sides are doing if they're doing like some kind of water rescue. And so that's the other thing that these studies, especially when you do something complicated, and to like your question, Genevieve, like what are these round things? Like I would zoom in and try to understand like, okay, there's a lot of wires coming from it, so it's obviously some sort of electronic, and then thinking about like what would a helicopter need electronics out front for, and you can start to kind of piece together like a detective what the purpose for some of these things that even though you don't need to be an engineer, you can make some assumptions that are probably pretty safe to make. Um, this guy over here on the side looks like it's just kind of grafted to the nose, like a weird big pimple, so I'm going to do my best to make it look natural. Well, thank you. It's just, like I said, remember the first thing I did was just this line down the center, which is the perspective line. So it's all about just starting somewhere. And you have to honor that start place, even if it's a little off, because you can't keep fixing your perspective as you go. You have to just say to yourself, like, that's the perspective I gave myself. This is what I have to work with. Let's make the best of it. So when you look at everything in its entirety, it can look a little overwhelming and very difficult, but all of these steps, and that's what I'm trying to share, all these steps are just one small thing that builds upon itself. So all of these things are attainable by just about anybody who wants to try hard enough to do it. You know, like I can draw these ellipses relatively easily in this perspective because I've drawn so many ellipses in perspective that I don't have to do all the construction that goes into it. Same thing with this shock going down to it. Like I've done enough landing gears that I kind of know what that shape looks like. Like this side piece is actually kind of wonky, and I'm going to redraw it because that's the kind of thing that would really bug me later. Because it comes straight out, and I had kind of messed with the perspective in a not pleasing way. Yeah, that looks better. So you can also, we're not going to get crazy into the details, but I can see part of the interior from this point of view. It just looks like a giant box, you know, like your dash would be in your car. I'm also going to draw through to the window a little bit, and the windows again are symmetrical, so I can just take my perspective lines over and fill them in. I'm also going to guess that they're going to want to see out the top, and there's some indication that there are windows up here, but you can't really see them. But I'm going to add them because I think that that's right. And so again, this is just another one of those things like trying to put yourself in the position of who actually made this object. I think it's a safe bet that they would want windows on the top so they could see up. I'm not going to draw those sensor pods on there because I think they would just be a little bit distracting. I am going to draw the outside of the door though, because I think that this tells you something about the construction of the object. You know, it's got hinges here. I'm just indicating. Let's see what else. Okay, the rotor. So I can see that it's got, so we could sit and try to understand how these work, and I don't think 2 hours would be enough because the mechanics that go into making a helicopter rotor work, if you've ever looked at one, are insanely complex. So we're just going to work with the big shapes, which is a cylinder going down the center, and then a larger mass at the top, which I think is fairly safe to just break down into another cylinder, albeit a very short, fat one. So while I'm sketching on this, is anybody that's watching this right now like drawing along, and like what kind of things are you guys drawing? Or if you're not drawing along right now, are you drawing anything like in your own time? I'm just curious what people are keeping themselves busy with. Okay, I'm also seeing that like it's a safe assumption to create just a cylinder for each of the rotors. And I'm just going to keep it really simple and just have them facing forwards and backwards, just for clarity's sake. And I think the rear one is probably similarly built. Yeah, it's pretty close. It's a little less complicated, but it's generally the same shapes. So I'm just kind of indicating for myself like the length of all of these pieces before I sketch them in. So these rotors are probably more complicated than I'm giving them visual time for, but I'm really trying to understand the overall vehicle, and I am not too worried about being a little bit prescriptive for the other parts. So I'm not going to hold myself over the coals if some of the stuff is not detailed out exactly, because what we're really trying to get is the essence of what this object is. And so I think it has to do more with these big forms and how they come together. Because again, you kind of have to pick your battles with what's important. And that's another part of these studies that hopefully is going to help you out, because when you look at an object after this, hopefully you can look at something and say like, oh, if I had to break that up into its primary and secondary shapes, like what would they be? Like, and that could be looking at a car, you know, a Nike shoe, it could be anything. Because all visual objects can be broken up in this way to some degree or another. There's obviously, you know, some things that don't really fall into any one category, but I think this is a fairly simple and safe way to look at the world and understand it in a way that allows you to recreate it, which is the whole point of doing these studies, is being able to recreate objects. Okay, and so the big rotors I can see are hitting almost to the end of the tail, so I want to get the size relatively right. And I'm also noticing that they dip down quite a bit when they're not in use, so I'm just going to shrink this a little bit because I do want to put those rotors in there. So just like I did for the tail, I'll give myself a center line. I'm just kind of eyeballing this a little bit. Okay, so the leading edge of the rotor is flat, and then it comes to a flat end, and it's got kind of this 45-degree kink on the other side. So that's what I'm going to try to recreate. Again, I'm just drawing these rotors front to back and left to right, just because it's easier. Yeah, I gotta talk to Mike and see how things are going with him. I hope he's good. I'm pretty sure he's out of quarantine now, but I just wanted to check in on him. It's gotta be scary coming back from Italy when all this stuff was going down a few weeks ago. So you have to be careful when you're drawing something that rotates from a center and each of the parts, like a spoked wheel, are slightly different. It's really easy to draw something that's wrong, because what these rotors look like is like this. So you have to make sure that you have them rotating correctly, which sounds really simple, but for whatever reason, drawing things in this shape can trip people up. So that's like, that's what it should look like if you do it right. Last one. There, so I feel like I learned something about these proportions, just like sketching it out like this, that you know, are going to allow me to draw it again. Like I said, this is quite a bit more complicated than the chair, but oh yeah, totally. I for sure would be scared to give it to somebody else if I came back from someplace like Italy. Okay, so like I was saying, looking at this object, it's much more complicated than the chair, so it's going to be tough for me to do a lot of drawings of this because there's just more lines involved. But I think at least one more would be good to sketch this out. And again, I'm going to do my best not to look at any reference for this. I'm just going to try to draw it kind of from my brain and see how far I can get. So looking at this, trying to imagine what a interesting second view would be. I think from below would be kind of cool. Like if I was to sketch it out real quick, just so I can visualize this, because it's a little bit hard to understand it from scratch right off the bat. I think something like that could be pretty cool. So I'm just imagining what it would look like to like look up at it. Yeah, so I think that could be cool. So all of my perspective is vanishing up, like if you were looking at a building in front of you. This box is actually laid out nice enough that I think I'm just going to use this as my underlay. Getting this first perspective right is super important when you're drawing something, whether it's from reference or out of your head. Getting these first lines correct is super important because, like what I was saying before, is that you define your perspective in the beginning of your drawing, and so everything that follows that relies on what you are saying reality looks like. So in this case for me, reality is this upward look for the helicopter. And so I'm just trying to remember all of the different parts that I just sketched out moments before and what they would look like from this perspective. This is quite a bit different, just because, you know, we're looking at a completely different face of this object, but just because we're looking at a different view of it, all of the things that made that object correct in terms of its proportions still apply. So I've got my center line there. I've blocked out my passenger cabin. You won't see much of the, what's it called? You won't see much of the cockpit because you can see like my section line, because my verticals are up and down right here, the section's going to follow it. And that's going to give me top of the shape. Same here. And now it's just going to taper off really quickly to the tail. And all of these things are true regardless of the direction you draw it in. The tail is getting pointy too quick, so I think it's actually back here further, so I'm going to redraw these. And I know that because the proportions just didn't look right. And I've never drawn a helicopter from this point of view, but based on drawing it that first time, I have enough internal memory of what those parts look like to get this at least in the ballpark of being right. Okay, so I'm having a hard time remembering what that shape was, and I remember it was weird. I think I might have drawn it backwards just now. Yeah, try that. So it actually looks like it's kicked off in this direction, which is the opposite of what it should be doing, so I'm going to redraw this, again to follow my vertical. Yeah, that looks more accurate to me. So I'm going to erase away that part. I'm just going to give myself a quick line for where I want the rotor to be pointed. Now you can see like left to right would be that line. I just kicked it up slightly to define where the rotor's going to be. And now I can drop in simple lines for the tail, which is pretty easy because it's just a rectangle. Now let's put the engines on. I think that they do stick out slightly. I know that they started right about in the middle of the passenger compartment, so I'm going to start here. And they will follow this perspective line back and then kick out for the exhaust. I should really be focusing on the bottom of this thing first because there are things on the bottom like the landing gear and those wings that I know are going to cover some of the other objects. So what I'm doing right now is just, again, I think this surface needed to be drawn in so I could understand it better. And doing all these sections just helps me start to put this object together in my head. It's almost like a Lego set that's being built from nothing. At least with Legos, you have all the parts you can click together, but when you're drawing something, you have to make up all of those connections for yourself. Okay, so the first thing you would see are the landing gear. So I know that there's one in the center, and I think it's probably going to be 2 wheels because there's a lot of weight to be pushed down here. Yeah, Genevieve, boxes are definitely the way to go to start with. You know, just draw 1,000 cubes in perspective, and at the end you will understand it more easily. Okay, so I'm putting the wings in on the front, and the reason I'm doing that is because, again, in the same way that the perspective had to come before the body had to come before the wings. So what I'm going to do now is drop in sections of the suspension that hold on to the wheels that I know are attached to the wing. And so it's just like it's following steps of a recipe that you're kind of making up in the moment. So that can be a little complicated, but you just have to understand that like all of this starts from a single point, and that was the perspective. And everything's going to follow that. I know that there was a part here, which I'm just going to say is a cylinder because I don't understand it well enough to make it any more complicated than that. But now I've got my 2 wheels in the front. And I think the next thing I want to do is those giant pontoons on the side, which are just these big pill shapes. Got one there. And they have that paint job on the front that just cuts off the end. And then this one is going to be slightly smaller because of perspective, and it's also going to be covered up a little bit because there's a little bit of the body in front of it because it was pushed up right against it. So it would be like over here, but I'm just not going to draw that because I think it's hidden. And then I think you could see a little bit of the wing on top of that shape. Yeah, I think that looks okay. Got the window here, and then I remember from the reference, but I didn't draw it in. There are those, maybe I did draw it in. I'm not going to look though because I'm trying to do this from scratch. So these 2 windows here are so the pilots can look down their feet and see what's underneath them. I don't want to leave the bottom completely bare because I know it's not actually like that. So I'm just going to draw in like, you know, some hatches or something that helps the viewer understand the form. So right now, this is just, I mean, there could be any kind of shape on the bottom of this helicopter, but because I have some, you know, understanding of like cut lines that you would see on a vehicle, I can take my experience now and kind of mash that together with what I'm drawing and create believable looking cut lines that are at least halfway realistic to the point where somebody's not going to look at it and say like, oh, you drew a, you know, a dog or like, I don't know, some organic shape that just wouldn't make sense. Like, the trick is to get to the point where you can draw well enough that you can fill in gaps in what the reference is showing you, and before you realize it, you will start filling in those gaps in your own work. Like, that's what doing studies like this is going to give you. That visual library inside your brain is never going to go away. I mean, I guess it could if you stop drawing, but it will be with you when you are just doing your blue sky sketch ideations. And because of that, your sketches will start to be filled in with accurate things because you are, you know, if we're talking about a designer, you're drawing things that have to exist on planet Earth. And things that exist on Earth look a certain way for a certain reason. And the more you can communicate that visually, I don't know, the easier your professional life is going to be, let's say. You know, all these tricks, all these little, like, realizations about what these surfaces are doing. If I took this understanding of this helicopter, think of something else as like a similar shape. Like, I feel like I could draw a submarine better now than I could before I started doing this study, because I think a submarine is like a pretty similar shape to like a big rescue helicopter like this, because it has to move through water just like this helicopter has to move through the air. And so you just gain these weird little secondary bonus learnings from doing studies like this. So what I'm doing right now is just dropping in a little bit extra line weight. And then the other thing that's really important for a helicopter, especially from this view, and it would be really like interesting looking, if you were being rescued by it, or if you were just trying to draw something really cool looking, is getting the rotors to look right. And so what I did is lay out my perspective lines, and I'm just really roughly blocking in where I think the rotors would be. And I think it just like having this big round shape be right is going to give this drawing like a more of a sense of completeness and just intensity and interest. So now I'm just blocking in the rotors. I don't think you'd see much of the one on the end. And they're straight now, because if this thing is flying, the tension of being flung around at however many thousands of RPMs per minute, or rotations per minute is already per minute, so it's kind of redundant, but however quickly these things are spinning around makes them go completely straight, and it takes all the slack out. So now all I'm doing is just adding in little details that help these forms that I sketched in read more clearly. So back here for the tail, a little section line. And now I'm just going to do a quick outline and a slightly thicker line to finish this drawing off. So I'm pretty happy with this one. I feel like this looks very accurate to the proportions of what I studied, and I feel good about that because it proves my theory that if you have an understanding of perspective and you have enough insight to take something apart visually in a really simple, deliberative way, you can become a pretty talented draftsman, illustrator, designer, and now you can go draw things like much more easily out of your head. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. It definitely looks better than my first one, and that's extra good because I drew this one from my brain. So I'm just going to add a quick shot of color just to fill it in because I like how this looks and I want to work on it more. Also, I really love yellow. It's like one of my favorite colors. If you see a lot of my work, I'm very limited in my color palette, and yellow is definitely something that I enjoy using. And the other nice thing about working from reference digitally, like you can see I just color picked this color from my actual reference, and so it's a lot easier. I mean, I guess I'm kind of working against what I said you should be doing by doing that. Like if I really cared about doing studies, I would also try to get these colors right, but I am going to be lazy in this moment because I don't have a lot of time, and I'm just going to color pick. And if you don't like it, you can leave. I'm just kidding. There's only 3 of you, so that would really be a hit to my ego if you left right now. Okay, we're almost done with this one, and then I will get to my last subject for the night. Got about half an hour left. And I'm just doing simple color blocking like this is really enjoyable and fun to do. And it's way easier in Photoshop to just knock this stuff in. But yeah, I feel pretty good about that. I think it turned out okay. I'm just going to lighten it up a little bit so my line work can be seen through. But yeah, so that's how you study a helicopter. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay, I'll do a quick cylinder demo, Genevieve. So the simplest form to draw in perspective is obviously a rectangle, so start there. So just got your basic rectangle. I'm going to draw through just because it'll make this easier to understand. And my proportions are bad. I should feel bad. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. Okay, so we have our perspective box. And so all circular forms can fit inside rectangular form. So whether we're doing a cylinder or a sphere or anything else like that, you can draw it perfectly by starting with a rectangle. So we've got our box, and now we have to find the center of the box. The way you can find the center is by doing a set of diagonals. So now I know my center of this box is right there, because that's where those two diagonals work. And you can tell that this works no matter what, because there's a box here. I'm going to connect the diagonals. And now when I transform this in perspective, it will always show me where my perspective lines need to go. Because I can pick the middle of this line, and then make sure I hit the middle of that one, and it will always be at the middle. So when you're drawing it freehand, do it like this. So you've got that center there, and now this line allows you to find the center for everything else, because all these other lines just have to be parallel to the ones on either side of it. So this vertical line is parallel to the one on the left and the one on the right, and the last one just connects those two. So same thing on the side. So what we will have at the end of this is a rectilinear form that's been sectioned off vertically and horizontally. So the reason I did that is because now, if I was to draw a circle on a square, this is very rough, apologies. A circle will be perpendicular to each of the points that connect to the edges of the square. So right here, right here, right here, and right here, it's all perpendicular, which means that this arc hits at a 90-degree angle to this line. So that arc in here, right at that edge, that's 90 degrees. So that applies in perspective. So for you, on the ground, what it means is that all you have to do instead of drawing a whole circle is just connect this arc to this arc, or I'm sorry, that line to that line to that line, and so on and so forth. So now we have an ellipse, and my perspective is a little off because I'm just trying to show this concept, but we have an ellipse in the front, and an ellipse on the back. And again, I'm just connecting these dots. In the same way I broke down those studies, I'm breaking down this cylinder to its simplest points. So now we've got a circle in the front and a circle on the back. All we have to do now is connect the top and the bottom of that circle. And voila, you have a cylinder. So I will keep that one on a smaller layer so you can see, or a lighter layer, because I'm going to erase away all the extra stuff, here that I don't need. But essentially that is how you get a cylinder in perspective, and that works in any perspective, any point of view. All you have to do is draw a rectangle that has a cube on the end. I guess that's the most important part. The ends of it have to be a square. They can't be like a rectangle that's 3 times longer than it is tall. It has to be a square. A circle will only fit in a square. Oh, looks like I erased some of that stuff, so continuing to erase away. And hopefully you can see that underneath this cylinder is all the construction lines that went into it. And at the end, you have a cylinder that works in perspective. It's a little iffy around the edges, but that's because my perspective is bad. And that goes back to my earlier point where if your perspective is not correct, everything you do on top of it will be equally incorrect. Does that make sense? I'll leave that in here. If you want to look at this later, the Photoshop file will be up on the Google Drive. Okay, I've got 17 minutes. I think I will probably just draw this little guy, which is a Moto Compo scooter, which is one of my favorite little 80s strange design projects. This was sold, and it was sold with a car. I think it was a Honda Civic from like the late 70s, early 80s, and this thing was like in the trunk of it. And the idea was that in cities, people would drive their car to a parking lot that is kind of far away from where they work, and then they would pull the scooter out and then ride their scooter the rest of the way to work. And you can pick this thing up because it only weighs, I don't know, like 50 pounds or something. Maybe it's heavier than that. But you could pick it up and like carry it inside with you. So, I don't know, I've always just really liked it. But I've never drawn one before, so that is what I'm going to do now. Okay, this guy is pretty easy to break down into its component parts. For this, I'm going to take a few shortcuts since I'm just going to be doing what I did before. I just want to illustrate it in a slightly different way. Okay, so pretty clearly we've got our main form that is a rectangle with parts cut out of it, and there's a little bit of an angle on the bottom. So I'm just looking at proportions and like just looking at it, like it's pretty obvious that this thing is, I think, relatively symmetrical. I think the swing arm is probably on both sides. It's a little tough to tell because there's plenty of scooters out there that have single-sided swing arms for simplicity's sake, but I think I'm going to err on the side of guessing that it's symmetrical. The wheel also goes up into here, so this body has got a fender, which I can see there, so that space is empty. There's an engine that also is in the center. I know this thing, so this seat actually sits down on the inside, so there's got to be some kind of hole that this fits in, and that goes for the front forks as well. Those, I think, telescope, so what that means is that they go up and down. So I think that there's going to have to be some kind of like mechanism in there. And then we just have very simple front forks that go up to the top. So if we get rid of the top, this is a pretty simple little object. Now, because I'm in Photoshop, I'm just going to show you what I'm going to do. And in the same way I had that helicopter and I created a center line for myself, I'm going to try to do a more interesting drawing where, let me hide that for a second. So I want this perspective to be really exaggerated because I want to do something that's entertaining to myself to draw. So this is a really exaggerated perspective that you would normally use for something like a building. Again, it's a little bit fish-eyed, it's a little looser, but because I'm in Photoshop, in the same way that I was just like messing around and transforming that that cylinder, I can take the corners of this side view that I just sketched in and yank it around and actually make it fit perfectly within my perspective drawing. You can do this with some vehicles, but what this ends up doing is it keeps all of my proportions correct. And what I'm doing now is just subtly warping that side view to match the warp that I have going on in my perspective. So see this line in the middle of this bike? I need it to follow that line in the perspective. So I'm going to curve it just a little bit so it feels correct with what my perspective is doing. I'm glad I did this. I was just going to draw it from scratch, but because this is technically a digital sketching workshop, having these little tricks to do. See, here it looks kind of messed up, like you wouldn't really know what to do with that, but because hopefully you can see how it fits within my perspective, now I have a pretty useful underlay to start drawing on top of, which is great because I only have 12 minutes left, so let's just see how far I can get. And again, I'm using layers, and so these underlays I can just hide when I'm done. But yeah, let's start knocking it in. So I think the section of this thing is very square. So I'm just going to draw kind of the rectilinear portions of this thing. It's got a tight little radius on the front. It's going to disappear in the back. And I'm just working out the main forms. So here I'm just outlining the radiuses. I'm going to do I'm going to stop looking at this because again, I tried to take down as much info as I could, and because I'm moving quickly, I don't want to be referencing that. I want to really see if I can remember those different parts of it. And also I've got this decent underdrawing, so I won't get too lost. Even if I mix up some details, the general vibe of the sketch will still hopefully be correct. So yeah, I'm just going to keep working on this, and I don't have a ton to add to it just because I am going to be essentially duplicating everything that I just did for the chair and now this little scooter. So does anybody, as we're wrapping up here, have any questions about anything I went over, or is there anything you'd like me to clarify before I wrap things up here? This actually goes back further, because I know that there was that black plastic piece, but I need to get this front fender correct first. I also appreciate those of you who have stuck around hanging out for this. I really think that if you take these design studies to heart and start doing this, just do one a day. They don't take very long. I promise you, you will become a better artist, and it will happen quicker than if you were just drawing things in your environment. Because the way that I've laid out this little program forces you to be deliberative and critical about what you're drawing, which is the trick to becoming a good artist. I know it's got 3 spoke wheels. I remember that. I didn't draw it, but I thought that was a cute touch. Smaller vehicles usually have less spokes. That's another just thing that if you design enough objects with wheels, you start to understand little peculiarities, like a luxury vehicle, like a Mercedes, for instance. It's more likely that it will have a greater number of spokes. Like really nice, expensive wheels often have, rather than 3, something more like 12 or even more. And that's because they're complicated to make. So that's not anything that the general like Mercedes-Benz buyer understands. They just know that many spoked wheels feel expensive to them, but the real reason is because they're hard to make. And it seems pretty simple when you think about it. Obviously, something that's harder to make is going to be more expensive than something that's easier to make. But when you understand that underlying reasoning, it makes you a better designer, because now you can make something look luxurious by like maybe making it complicated or making a larger number of whatever it is that you're designing. Hey, Josiah, good to see you. No worries, there will be more. This is not a very, like, I mean, it's going to be up here, so feel free to just check in. The stream will be just in my channel, so if you want to see what I did, feel free to just skip through it at your leisure, and you can see what we've been doing. But right now I'm just finishing up a little Moto Campo sketch, and I've been talking about deliberative design studies and how that can make you a better designer. Yeah, Genevieve, just don't focus too much on the tool. I mean, this is a digital sketching workshop, but honestly, it's better to figure out all these perspective things with a piece of paper and a pencil before you get into Photoshop, because it's a more complicated tool. It's essentially a more complicated pencil, and the less you can have to deal with learning a tool and learning proper perspective, the better off you'll be. I think you're better off just isolating everything you can to be as comfortable to you as possible, and just focus on perspective for now. So, I mean, feel free to learn Photoshop, but just know that you will learn quicker if you focus on just perspective, just with pencil and paper, or pen and paper, whatever you feel most comfortable using. Okay, these forks I'm having a hard time remembering. I know that they are just little stalks, but I think there was pretty obvious, I think these are turn signals. I just remember it because it kind of looked like an alien. It's another little trick you can do. If you see something like very significant to your design, make like a mental note, like you would try to remember somebody's name. Like if you meet somebody named Paul, like in that moment I'd say to myself, like, oh, like my uncle's name, because I'm terrible with names. So hopefully that little rejoinder of like, oh yeah, my uncle's name, like will give you enough of a seed of an idea to work your way backwards to figure out what the answer is. Hey Joe, I have you here. How's work been going? I imagine you guys have had to slow things down quite a bit with how much work you have in China. I'm going to add some buttons up top because I think it had some kind of control. Okay, 9:16. I got some time still. Drawing the bottom of the body. I just basically give myself a pill shape for the engine, but I know it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's definitely a place to put your feet, so some kind of foot peg, which I'm going to put up here, because I think based on the way the scooter is built, it makes more sense to have it up front. I think I also remember seeing something like a kickstart over here, so I'm going to try drawing that in. A kickstart is like, new motorcycles, you just turn the key, press a button, and it turns on, but older bikes, you have to actually kick over to get them going. I don't really know what's going on back here, so I'm just adding random bolts, things that I think look right. Oh, you know what? I totally forgot about the engine, which I don't think you would actually be able to see, but I will indicate because it's a part of the design, which is that little loopy spot down there. And actually, you know what? Now that I've drawn this fender, I'm going to guess that you'd be able to see the top of the cylinder head right there. So, see, this is what doing a little bit of like visual detective work allows you to do. So now we can see the cylinder head, that's the fender, and that's a little pass through. Let's get that rear tire in there because I'm pretty sure we would be able to see it. Draw the bottom of the body, little indication of a fender. And then just based on the way I've drawn my perspective, I'm kind of guessing at where that rear tire would be. So yeah, I feel pretty good about that. So you can see when I pull my perspective lines away, I've got this goofy looking little scooter, which this is why I like this thing, because it is very silly looking. So now I'm just adding in details. I don't think there's a headlight, but I'm going to draw one in because I think it makes sense to have a headlight. Knowing a responsible company like Honda, they wouldn't make a scooter without a headlight. I think it says Moto Compo on the side. So I'm just kind of indicating loosely the lettering, which is very square, which makes it easy to put down. And I think the seat was kind of quilted. Indication of like a little bit of a, I don't know, some kind of warning sticker there. I'm just drawing some reflections on the front forks. And then drop in a quick shadow. So pretty simple lighting scenario. It's just lit directly from above. I'm just following all these little parts, imagining that there was like a string just going straight down from all these parts. And that's how we define where the shadow is. And now I'm just going in and adding more details to make it more believable. Just simple little line indications. Tread on the tire, lenses, and the glass. Just trying to pick places that will make the drawing like more fun to look at. Also, if you can do believable repetitive shapes like a tire tread, it goes a long way to making the actual object seem more believable. Now I'm just adding in some bolts here and there because this thing had to be built by somebody. So indications that human hands have touched it. I think there might have been a rear tail light, I'm not sure. Stitching on the seat. Just little details like that. Yeah, pretty happy with that. And we can go back and, you know, I missed a few details. I think I definitely made it too skinny, top to bottom. But, you know, it's the spirit of it is there, and for the first drawing, I mean, I'm sure if, like the other things that we had gone over, if I had taken the time to draw this multiple times, I would have gotten it right eventually. So I am okay with this being okay. And 2 hours goes by a lot quicker than you would expect when you talk through the entire thing. And I'm happy I continue to be able to make 2 hours of talking go by, because just thinking about that makes me exhausted. So I hope you guys got something out of this. I enjoyed doing it, and I think this is probably week 10, so I think we have 4 or 5 more of these left. I don't know how many more weeks are in the semester, but regardless, I'll keep doing these just because we're all indoors and we might as well get something out of it. In the meantime, I am just going to keep coloring this in for the next few minutes. And if you guys have any questions about what we did, if you'd like to see anything, I think I might do another like single rendering coming up here. Like I might render out like a line drawing I've already completed. I have a handful of other suggestions in the syllabus, but if anybody is struggling with something, or would just like to see me work on something that you have a personal interest in, let me know and I will see if I can work it in. So now I'm just color blocking really simply. This thing, just like that helicopter now that I think about it, is really only red and black. So it's pretty easy to color in. And much like a coloring book, as long as you stay inside the lines, you can be reasonably assured that your final product will look, you know, decent at least. It's in the shading that the stuff really starts to come together. So right now it looks like pretty elementary, but as soon as you drop in a few gradients here and there, you could make this kind of silly illustration look like it's shaded very realistically, which is a fun kind of like trick to play on a person's eye. Like I like, you know, silly drawings that are very realistically rendered. And vice versa. I appreciate like a really well drafted line drawing that is like, you know, colored in by a little kid. I just like contrast like that. Okay, I've got 5 minutes left, so I am just going to keep working on this. So, yeah. Let's get some colors in here. Simple little color breakups make a big difference. I kind of got the logo in the right place, close enough. So now I'm going to use the lasso tool and a very soft brush to just blow in some really subtle shading. I'm going to use a really saturated dark. Multiply layer so the colors underneath show through, and I'm going to use a very soft brush. The nice thing about using a soft brush is it just allows you to, make some mistakes without it being too obvious. Bring the opacity of this layer down a little bit because it's just a little aggressive at the moment. But I'm essentially just lighting everything ultra simply. So the light is coming from the top. Things on the side will be slightly darker, and things underneath objects or facing downward will get the most shadow. I'm glad you went back through that, Joe. Yeah, I was pretty happy with that. I was just saying, when you get the proportions right, you can draw, if you understand perspective, you can draw anything in any position after that. It's just a question of understanding the subject matter and then understanding perspective. Those two things together allow you to draw an infinite universe of things. Okay, so it's a shadow layer, and now I'm just going to quickly bring in a light layer. And it's just going to be pure white, and I just turn the opacity down a little bit. So this is just going to be all my highlights. Cylinders get this rim lighting effect. Again, that's just one of those things you pick up after doing a billion cylinders in different renderings. The tops of everything are lighter. I'm going to use the lasso to isolate just the top of this scooter because I don't want a lot of overspray. Just like if you're using a spray can, you would put down, tape or something to get hard edges. Well, thank you, Joe. This is my, like I was saying earlier, I think 10th or 11th workshop, so I have been refining my point making abilities. So I'm just grabbing everything that's facing upwards because this takes a little bit of work right now, but as you will see in a second, there will be a payoff in the end. Okay, so now I'm going to hide that selection even though it's still there, and now I can just come in with this, and you can see it just starts to lighten up the top. I'm going to light up the edges of the seat a lot because it's a glossy material. Same for this front wheel. And the edge of the engine. So there you go, you can see it being turned on and off. Makes a pretty big difference. All these radiuses will also get a little bit, it's looking a little pink, and that's because it's not on a mixing layer. So I think what I'm going to do is do overlay. Yeah, that looks better. That's more red now than it was before. So that's overlay and then normal. You can see how big a difference picking the right filter can be. And then on top of that, now I'm just painting straight full opacity because I just want to get some full highlights and full darks in here. All right, well, just about done here. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a good week. Stay safe, and I will see you here next Monday. The Photoshop file is going to go up on the shared drive for the Western course, and if anybody wants to go back and see any of these points I've illustrated, feel free to watch this video, which should be up on my channel momentarily after it's done streaming. So, yeah. Thanks again.